Come on out, everybody. So, I'm Eric Hesseldahl from Recode, and we're going to talk about securing the enterprise in a lot of different ways. All the big companies. So I'll let all the panelists, let's just start. This guy you know, he was just here, but introduce yourself again for those on the stream.
Okay, I'm Vincent Steckler, the CEO of AVAST Software. AVAST is the producer of the most popular endpoint security products in the world, mostly for the consumer market. For the mobile, though, we're also heavily into the enterprise.
Thank you. Raj Samani, Chief Technical Officer for Intel Security, formerly known as McAfee. I also work as Special Advisor to the European Cybercrime Center, and we are the most popular endpoint security company in the world.
Okay, these guys are going to have.
We have a disagreement here. Yes.
It's going to be a fun panel.
It depends on who you ask and how you measure it. We'll stipulate that.
Hello, good morning. Stephen Rymell from Airbus Defense and Space CyberSecurity. Wearing two hats, I think, today, both as a service provider internally for Airbus and also providing services externally on the market.
Okay.
Many, many years engaged in cybersecurity activities with different organizations, also with the British government in the past, but now here based in Germany.
Okay.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Marc Bütikofer. I'm the CTO and Director Innovation of Airlock. Airlock is part of the Swiss company Ergon Informatik AG, and we provide security solutions for protecting web applications and other HTTP-based interfaces. Okay,
so I don't like to use a lot of buzzwords, things like advanced persistent threat and endpoints and things like that. I basically rail against that. But I want to start our discussion at a really high level. And what I think is still new to me, and I still struggle to get my head around it, is that the days of corporate IT security when you flipped on your firewall and gave everybody a lecture about a strong password and hoped for the best are pretty much over. The nature of what we're protecting is a lot more complex, and there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more value to the information and to the relationships. So I thought we would just run down the left to right how you kind of define and think about the scale of things that you're protecting for your clients, what they're coming to, what you see kind of on the horizon. Let's just kind of start with sort of a big view, and then we'll kind of drill down into some of the particulars. So, Vince, why don't you start?
Okay. The old turn on the firewall. I remember I used to work for what was at the time the largest endpoint security company in the world, who was Symantec. And I remember years ago when they first provisioned me with a PC, a laptop, of course, and they didn't give me the lecture on the firewall. But they very nicely had on the desktop this file called README First that very conveniently had all the passwords in it that I needed. Very, very helpful. I really appreciated it. But that's how kind of security was, even for a security company, say, 15 years ago. Rather porous. And I think now what's happening is people realize that that the challenge really is the data. Even on the consumer side or on the corporate side, it's the value of the data that you have in your network, and how do you have to protect that data. And people have realized that it's far more beyond endpoint, firewalls, antivirus, intrusion detection, that it's now a very, very complicated thing, that data is very valuable, and data is what the bad guys are after, be it from businesses or from consumers. Challenge you have on the consumer side is that consumers don't put value on their data. They put value on the device. So if they buy a device for $300, they don't want to pay $60 to protect that. That's 1/5 of the price of the device. It doesn't make any economic sense for them. And businesses have a little bit of that issue also, but I think they're much more cognizant to the value of the data.
Yep.
So I actually want to change the discussion slightly, because I think each and every single one of us here in this room and listening to this stream are probably in the most exciting time of our lives, because what we're witnessing is remarkable innovation, remarkable opportunity. You know, actually back to your point earlier, was anybody surprised that WhatsApp were acquired for $19 billion? Anybody?
I
right?
was.
Yeah, you were surprised. But think about it. They had every single one of those accounts was worth $42 a user. And if you look at Instagram, for example, Instagram were acquired at $30 a user. And if you look at YouTube, they're acquired at $20 a user. So the actual value of personal data is actually increasing. And, you know, back to your point, the perceived value of personal data is decreasing. So for me, I think, you know, if we look at the world around us, we have this remarkable opportunity to, you know, free up personal data. We have these new business models. For example, you know, utilities will have more data than Facebook could ever dream of, you know, through smart metering, for example. So for me, you know, the world ahead is really exciting. And I think, you know, for us as, and I don't even call us as security professionals, because we're not security companies. We're the organizations that help build trust into digital systems. And you're going to need that when you're driving 70 miles an hour. Actually, you're in Germany, you can drive whatever speed you want. But when you're driving 100 miles an hour down the road with your family in there, you need to know that you can trust the digital systems that have your family in there. You don't want to have the same issue that you've had in, you know, in the Ukraine, for example, whereby attacks have resulted in outages of power.
Okay.
I must say, probably in this panel, I'm the old timer here, and I can even go back to the days of paper cards and the small glass room in the corner of the building where the computer center was based. I can even remember a day when they were suffering a regular outage. Every single day, a particular time, the machine would go down, until they discovered that it was actually the cleaner in the corridor was pulling the plug out, plugging the vacuum cleaner in, and then when she'd finished, plugging the original plug back in. And those are the days of the security concerns that the organization had then.
Anybody could just walk in and unplug the machine. Great.
I think now, just to take another angle, I think one of the biggest concerns that have developed for organizations that need to protect themselves is the change in the way that everybody works. You know, we're no longer looking at an organization that's a castle surrounded by the metaphorical stone wall. The data is out there. The people are out there with their mobile devices. We have data in the cloud. We are more and more blending personal and working life on those devices. The data is getting mixed. And you can no longer think in terms of protecting that wall around the castle. You really have to concentrate on thinking about the data that you want to protect, the assets in your organization that need the most close scrutiny. You have to assume that with all of those threats and that attack surface out there, that people will certainly get in. The question is then, how robust are your activities to make sure that you control the damage, that you can make sure that the really crown jewels inside your organization are thoroughly protected.
Do you also then assume in your kind of philosophy there, is there sort of a stated assumption that an attacker is going to get to your system at some level and therefore you have to manage?
I think there's a state of mind. It's not always certain that that's the case at any given point in time, but I think you have to work from the basis that your systems are or will be compromised. And that is a fact that will happen. We certainly within Airbus Defence and Space, we're constantly testing our defenses, measuring our response, and we can see exactly what happens under certain circumstances, and it's moving us more to that mold of not just deploying the prevention, but making sure that the whole structure of the organization, where we keep the critical things, and the response is there behind that.
I see. Okay, Marc.
Yeah, I partially agree with what you said at the beginning, or I want to emphasize this, that I see that digitalizing business, especially small business, is just at the very beginning. It's going to be more and more, it's not only putting your data, making your data of your company accessible to your customers or to your employees outside your business. It's more and more combining services, combining cloud services from other companies together with personal data. And I strongly believe that besides all these security measures that we are also going to discuss, like client security, like threat intelligence, and so on, that even small and medium businesses, and these are the vast majority of businesses in Germany and Switzerland and possibly whole Europe, they're not going to be able to employ all these security measures and put all this information together because it will not be feasible for them. Then I think the important thing is to find what are the places that you have to protect first to safeguarding your business. And there I strongly believe that it's by really protecting your technical interfaces you have, like your web services, your REST services, and so on the application level, not on firewalls and so on. We have been done this for 20 or 30 years now. We know how it's doing, but on the next level, we have to protect your data and your services. And I know from helping businesses for the last 16 years doing so, there's still a lot to do in this area, which sounds a bit profane, but there's still a lot to do because these are the simplest, the lowest level or lowest hanging fruits for attackers to gain access to your data, to steal your data, or to do denial of service attacks and so on.
This brings me to a very interesting point because we talk a lot about protecting this and protecting that, protecting this valuable trove of data here or that valuable trove of data there. But it also brings to mind that there's probably some very basic steps nowadays that people who run companies, who run, the IT, without having to contact any of you at this point. I think there's sort of like hygiene practices that people could probably turn on and start to use for free that you could probably make suggestions. And so Raj, let's start with you, and then Vince, and then we'll work down.
So what do you think is the most common entry for criminals into any organization? What is the most common tool used by criminals today?
Email.
Email.
That'd be my guess.
Yeah, it's as simple as that. If you look at actually all of the major hacks that you've seen, they all started with email. Even things like the $1 billion theft, Carbonac, which was attacks against Eastern European banks, was through email. And just this week, we had the Bangladeshi bank who were compromised for $80 million. And the only reason they were spotted was because the criminals spelt a word wrong. And Deutsche Bank, the routing bank, actually managed to detect that. So I do think you're right. There are cyber hygiene in terms of, getting people to understand not clicking onto emails, or, simple things like, making sure that you do have up-to-date security. The most common virus today is still Conflicker, which we've known for years now, over nearly a decade now. So, doing the simple things first raises the bar. And that, won't eliminate it, but it will reduce a lot of the, I guess what you said was the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
How many of us on this stage, how many of us in this room, let's do this, how many in this room use two-factor authentication on your email systems? I see 2 people, 3. How many of you, 4, how many of you don't know what two-factor authentication is? I'm curious. And don't be bashful. There's 1, okay, 2, okay. So would you all agree that two-factor authentication is a good piece of hygiene?
Well, let me ask another question very quickly.
Well, go ahead.
How many of you run antivirus? How many of you update your antivirus at least once a day? Twice a day? The issue is that it's a game of cat and mouse.
Right.
We just took down a botnet with the European Cybercrime Center called B-Bone, and that was a form of malware that was updating itself 35 times a day.
Wow.
So we are in this game of cat and mouse. We will innovate, they will innovate, but if we don't do the simple things right, then they're going to get in without doing.
So what's your best practice for updating? At least once a day?
Yes, at least.
As a user, Vince, do you agree?
Well, no, not at all, because I think we're making things too complicated for users. why the heck should a user have to know that their antivirus has been updated once a day, 10 times a day, 50 times a day? That should be done by the product. It should be completely transparent to the user. As techies, we tend to forget that 95% of our users have nowhere near the knowledge that we have. And we have to build systems for the general population, not for the techies. Like, to me, I think most everyone here was lying. Unless you're all techies, very few people should know what two-factor authentication is. And two-factor authentication is not going to fix your issues with being phished or scammed through emails. It's just going to fix the issue of can someone else easily get into your email or not. But I think the number one thing, I mean, it's nice to say that the number one weakness for security is the user. It's very true. Mm-hmm. But very close behind that is security companies and IT guys designing things for themselves and making it too complex for the normal user to really do. Even my IT guys, we just rolled out a new HR system and a new finance system. They rolled out different usernames and password schemes for them. And when you don't take care of simple things like that, that causes people to now write down their usernames and passwords this they can't remember, okay, this system I can use a question mark, but I can't use a bang sign, or I got to have 3 numbers in this one. This one over here, I can only have 2 numbers. We make things too complicated.
I agree with that. I mean, different passcode schemes drive me absolutely insane. And things are too complicated. But so that much I would see. I would agree with. So, Steve, why don't
I think just picking up on the point that Vince made about people are, if you like, the biggest risk is human nature, human behavior. I think reaching out to the organizations here, actually picking up also a point that we discussed beforehand, organizations are only a combination of many, many people, nothing more, nothing less. And the way the people behave, the way they understand the threats, and the way they respond in their normal daily life is a critical aspect of the security of the organization. I think if you just want to pick up some really, really basic understanding of where you stand as an organization, I do a little bit of advertising for the Alliance for CyberSecurity and the BSI. They've got a really great 13-point checklist. Takes maximum 1 day for an organization to fill in, actually just go through and consider all of the points that stand in there. Of course, we have user, you have emails, you have password, you've got a bunch of things there. Very, very good material if you just want to make a start and understand where you are in terms of your security status.
Marc?
I would like to add something to the point you said before about client security, virus scanners, and so on. I think this is, agree with you, this is a very important step to making it harder for people or computers getting infected, sending emails to companies, compromising their business and so on. But I think it's not really, the client is something that the service providers, the companies providing services to the net, and I think there is still, as I said before, there's a lot of business going to go more digital, providing more data, providing services to customers, to other companies. I think protecting the client is very important in raising the bar, but it's something you can really not control. I cannot trust the clients, even if there is probably scanners on it, if there is client security or not. It's just one piece in the whole puzzle. I think for the companies, the first thing that they should do, and I'm sure that many companies have not done that right yet, is protecting their data and especially protecting their services. And that should be as independent as possible from the client. Of course, we cannot go all the way and say we don't trust any client and it's okay, but from my point of view, this is the more important point because it's the point that we can control as businesses.
Okay. All right, let's kick things up a notch here. So the theme of this entire conference has been digital transformation. And yesterday I had a panel up here where we sort of debated what that meant. But one of the phrases that comes quickly along with digital digital transformation. See, I can't even say it. It's awkward. Is IoT. And so we're not just talking anymore about protecting the notebooks on the desktops and the servers in the data center. We're talking about protecting the sensor that is connected to the network that's grabbing data from the air conditioning unit or something in the manufacturing system. And so all this stuff that was never connected to the internet before, never connected to the corporate network before, is there. And it just feels to me like, and I think you'll agree, but I want you to try and address sort of the implications of all this. Those are all entry points. Those feel like entry points that an attacker could exploit. We've seen the Target case was probably the most widely known example where an air conditioning company got into a network by way of the air conditioning system and then compromised the entire corporate network. So let's talk about what the IoT stuff means for you. Raj, let's start with you.
So again, I'm going to try to be positive about this. For me, IoT represents an opportunity to do things differently. And I think, here we have the opportunity to integrate trust into the new way of working. A great example was, actually a good friend of mine runs actually responsible for security for an oil and gas organization. And what they were able to do is they built the world's first digital oil field. They have full remote management of offshore drilling from their central location. And the net result was they increased oil production from 400,000 barrels to 1 million barrels a day. That is the opportunity that IoT brings. And actually getting it right can create that term of digital disruption. In other words, doing things differently using technology. So for me, I think integrating trust into these systems and finding a new way of working provides us, actually, is what we need to do as a society because, population growth is going up, fossil fuels are depleting. We need to do this.
Right. So you get that. And yet, they still present a complication to the security.
Well, it's a different risk.
Yeah.
So a good example was if we look in healthcare, we have electronic health records. Now, electronic health records means that potentially anybody with a computer connection can actually gain access to this medical data. Now, is that more of a risk? Well, it's a different type of risk because previously, anybody that's been to a hospital will see these people walking around with these carts of medical data in paper and with no audit capability in any way, shape, or form. Now with digital data, we can actually have things like audit logs, access control, two-factor authentication, I apologize. We can start to have, so it's a different type of risk, but I think it's a risk that we have to move towards if we want to grow as a society.
Mm-hmm. Vince, what do you think?
Well, I think Internet of Things, you said you're going to stay away from these buzzwords, so it's nice to come back to it. I think it's kind of two different things. You got the Internet of Things kind of at the enterprise level, which is what we're talking about here. But then you got kind of Internet of Things that's really perceived as consumers and SMBs. And consumers and SMBs are very similar. So, here you're talking about all the devices, your HVAC devices, maybe your smart Samsung refrigerator, your Fitbits, etc. And I think Internet of Things, in that case, it's actually pretty damn simple. And I know that's not what people want to hear, but it's because most of those devices are friggin' stupid. They don't connect to the internet. They connect to a router somewhere. They connect to an access point. So they themselves, are not additional weaknesses or entry points. The weakness and entry point, fundamentally, for an SMB or a consumer in the Internet of Things is the router that has the connection to the internet. Now, unfortunately, as much as we may think that people should design for security, in high-volume devices, they design for cheap. And cheap doesn't go with security. So the most popular home router in the US costs $20 from Amazon, and it's riddled with known vulnerabilities. The most expensive home router in the US are the Apple routers with no known vulnerabilities. But $300 versus $20. What do people buy? Here in Germany, the most popular router, what's it called? Pardon? Fritzbox. lots of vulnerabilities,
Yeah.
cheap. So you're taking all these fairly dumb devices, you're connecting them to a very porous, cheaply built, insecure router, and that's where your weakness is. And if you're going to protect the Internet of Things and SMB and consumer, you got to focus on how the heck do you improve the security in the router, or if you can't, how do you layer it on top?
I disagree, and
That's fine.
But because I think these dumb devices, whilst they may not have a great deal of processing power, they are still collecting information about you, me, my family. I mean, in Germany, for example, you had these smart meters which were able to determine what TV shows people were watching.
Right. That's a really great example.
So I think we talk about security and we kind of fail to look at the concern around privacy. These dumb devices are collecting information, knowing when I'm using the hot tub or the fact that I'm watching Star Wars when I shouldn't. And we're going to live in this society whereby, which is back to your point, in which our personal data is being sold, traded, commoditized by companies, by criminals all across the world. And we need to start doing more to help get people to be aware about these considerations, I believe.
Yeah. I think a lot of those devices actually, I don't know, there was a study I read about a year or so ago where a lot of them turned out they're running Linux because it's cheap, to your point. But because they're running Linux, which is free, you can open up a terminal session on them and get administrative privileges. And they probably have default passwords for admin privileges.
Right. But I think the key thing is, ignoring the privacy side, which I really agree with, but the privacy side goes far beyond the Internet of Things. Like probably, for example, Google knows more about you than probably anyone else in the world. And it's not because they're in the Internet of Things, because they and Facebook just collect a massive amount of data about you in order to better serve up advertising.
Information that we willingly give them, too.
Yeah, and we give it to them more or less voluntarily. But most of the Internet of Things devices right now don't directly connect to the Internet. They're connecting through another point. So if you want to centrally protect everything, you got to protect that point. Now, in the future, they're going to get more sophisticated, and they're going to start directly connecting. And then is when you have the explosion of security threats.
Right. That's interesting. Steve, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I certainly can't disagree with what's been said about the consumer devices. I think maybe going back to the enterprise again, I would just consider, as an organization, it's already been expressed, this massive opportunity through digitalization, huge opportunities for efficiency. But as an organization, think about where old meets new. You have situations where you might be suddenly exposing an environment to a new threat surface, which didn't exist before, and where, especially when it's very old, there's plenty of organizations still running Windows XP. There's plenty of critical infrastructures out there which have to live for 40 years before they've got another investment coming along, and you can't switch them off, you can't shut them down. You start to expose those to some of the risks or issues associated with Internet of Things. Then you have to make sure that they're part of your consideration when you're building on these kind of efficiencies that you can take from the Internet of Things.
Mark, what do you think of IoT?
Especially when thinking about Internet of Things, I imagine that in 10 or 20 years, millions or billions of things are connected to the Internet. And I agree with you, Vincent, that probably one of the major problems is that it has to be cheap, and companies manufacturing things, Internet of Things, or things connected to the Internet, they focus on functionality. They want to have a little more functionality than the other vendor and so on. And they don't really do it right in terms of security. Not all of them, but many of them. Think of all the car hacking stuff that is now published or discussed about. I think now would be the opportunity for our industry, for the security industry, to do it right with Internet of Things, things connected to the Internet regarding security, because we have not done this right 20 years ago or 10 years ago regarding web services, web servers, and so on. We learned a lot how to do it, what to do, but in all these things I read in the press and on these forums and so on, I think people don't really have learned a lot of how important security is. Probably they don't really see how important security will be when all the things are connected to each other. You mentioned the car with the family. In future, it's you mentioned the health business and so on. There's lots of challenges we have to address, and I think this is the chance of the security business. We have to convince people in the company doing these things, and we have to convince also the consumers not to accept just devices that are cheap and that do what they're supposed to do, but also have an eye on how do they deal with privacy issues, how do they deal with identification, do the devices know whom are they talking to, do they know the users, do they only expose their services to who is supposed to use it, and so on.
I think if I may come back on that point, there's a challenge also with regard to people's understanding of data protection. I think we buy these devices, and sometimes they're even designed to collect your data. We willingly buy those devices. We willingly use them. And yet when you come to protecting in the enterprise, there's sometimes real concerns when the security officer comes to you and says, okay, we need to do these particular measures. It's not going to make life as comfortable as it was before. And we may be collecting some data about you, which actually you've probably already given away on one of your hand devices. But then there's a concern, and especially in Germany, I think the workers' councils rightly have a concern to make sure that the individual is protected. But I find an inconsistency in the approach there somehow.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about IoT. I'm going to bring another buzzword in. I know I hate to do it, but cloud. 4 years ago, when I first really started covering, well, actually it was more like 6 years ago now, but when I first really started closely covering corporate IT, there was a lot of anxiety among the decision makers, the CIOs, the CTOs and such, whether or not they were going to use the cloud, whether it was running an application on AWS or bringing in a SaaS application like Salesforce or Workday or whatever, and making it mission critical in such a way that they would be entrusting a third party with potentially critical data. And it's a really sensitive topic. It actually has some important legal ramifications here in Germany particularly, but I think widely in Europe as well. And I'm just curious what that means to the security environment, the way you think about it. I mean, now that anxiety is disappearing, companies are embracing cloud solutions, whether it's infrastructure or applications. How does that change the security makeup, the way you think of it, Raj?
So there is no such thing as cloud. I mean, it's a made-up term. There are companies providing services over the internet, and they market that as cloud. And some of them are good, some of them are bad. That's your job to find out and do your due diligence, as you are legally required, to find out which ones are good and which ones aren't. I mean, with that in mind, actually, we've just done a study, and we asked 1,200 senior people across the world about when is 80% of your IT going to be hosted in this cloud, and they said within 16 months.
Wow, 80%.
80%, yeah, which is remarkable. And now you're seeing this term cloud being used for water treatment applications or for critical infrastructure environments. For you as businesses, the most important thing you can do is to start to do your due diligence to make sure that the company that you are using, who are marketing themselves as cloud, are doing a good job of protecting your customer data, because you can outsource the work, but you cannot outsource the risk.
That's interesting. So by due diligence, let's get a little specific here. Yeah. The cloud, so-called cloud companies would have had audits or some other things done against their systems, and they have an economic motivation to want to be constantly upgrading and iterating their systems as they go. That's their motivation. So as a consumer, what's the best practice in terms of checking on them?
So you have no transparency in cloud, because if you want to know how secure your data center is downstairs and whether they use armed guards, you can walk downstairs. If you go to the big data center within the cloud, it's just not going to happen. And I should probably disclose I'm a Chief Innovation Officer for the Cloud Security Alliance and wrote a book on cloud security. So there are tools that can be used. For example, there's the STAR registry, which is a free portal that you can use to determine which cloud providers have actually done what certifications, security certifications. But I think where we start to move towards in the future is, real-time monitoring or situational awareness, whereby, you can actually query whether this cloud provider has deployed antivirus or whether this cloud provider has done these certain things. Getting transparency in a world that has no transparency is really where we need to move towards. And there are tons of free tools out there where you can start to query that and actually start to query the provider.
Vincent, do you believe in the cloud?
Do I believe in the cloud? I used to, because I'm an old guy, even older than these guys, I think, and to me the cloud takes me back to the days of IBM 370 with 3270 terminals and TSO.
That's old school.
That's old. But essentially just, as it says here, it's just you've outsourced providing of a service. Mm-hmm. Consumers are basically doing it based on a level of trust that they have with the company. They trust Apple. They trust Google. They trust Facebook. A whole bunch of these. And, they more or less trust Dropbox. They just probably find it too complicated and thus never use it. So you got a whole bunch of things on the consumer side. On the corporate side, I think it's like anything else. It's a little bit like the Wild West right now. You got to do your due diligence, but eventually they're going to have a shakeout, and you're going to have the big guys. You're going to have Oracle. You're going to have Amazon. You're going to have SAP. You're probably going to have IBM, maybe HP. And it's going to end up being just like the old days when you outsource stuff to IBM GS, and now you're going to outsource it to Amazon, and you're going to have an SLA, and you're going to make sure they're secure, et cetera. And the issue is, how do you get from the current state through the Wild West to that stable state?
What do you think?
I think it's very true that everything's been said. For the European companies, there's another consideration. It is just a data center somewhere. There's always the issue of European data protection and regulations, different laws in different countries about whether data is accessible or not in the event of legal cases. You need to very, very carefully think what type of data specialist you've got, data about your employees, where that's going to end up. Think very, very carefully about the quality of your provider, but also where they're exactly based, where that data is backed up, where it could finally end. Is it inside the European legislation zone or not? That could be something that you really need to consider.
Cloud, the word cloud is used in many different ways, like data cloud, persistence cloud, service cloud, whatever. It's a very wide term. So in my view, the most important thing of the cloud is combining services. It's combining services for individuals, for the consumers, and especially also for the businesses, for the companies. And I clearly see the trend to companies going towards a combined cloud solutions, with part of their services are driven by their own on premises or somewhere else. That doesn't really matter. And combining it with other services and from other companies, from other countries. And for the businesses, I think I agree with you, Raj. It's their job, the business's job, to make sure that the services, the cloud services, they're combining together to make their own service, that they are trustworthy, that they do their things right. I don't really think that we're near a place where a point where we have meaningful certifications for this. Probably we can encourage people to only accept such services, but I personally think that's a bit farther away. But companies really have to; they cannot outsource the responsibility or the risks when they provide data or services from other cloud services within their services. So I think it's for them, it's all about really knowing who is the user, who is the client, what data is the client accessing, what data can be combined and what not. But for the consumer, especially when you think of the cloud in some 10 years, when the cloud is much more also about devices, all the cars, all the fridges, all the toasters, whatever, put together. I don't think that the consumer can really know or feel or control what cloud services are used and what not. And I would like the consumer to give him back this information, to let him know who is going to keep what data of him. But that's really a challenge that I think there's no solution for this yet, unless maybe you have some ideas how this could be, because...
Yeah, there was a book I wrote.
Yeah.
So actually, yeah.
What was the conclusion of your book? Let's get there.
Well, page 1 said there are a ton of tools and I don't want to talk products, but there's a ton of tools and industry forums and working groups and best practices. I mean, ENISA, I've published a number of papers with them. ENISA is the European Network Information Security Agency around using cloud computing. And I think here's the thing that I implore every single person here is get engaged within the industry. You know, work with the CSA, it's a voluntary organization. You know, engage with ENISA. Start to look at best ways that we as an industry can help provide the world that I want my kids to grow up into. I don't want them to be sitting in a car which hasn't had security and privacy built in from the start. And I want them to understand the value of personal data, because companies are making money from my data, so why shouldn't I get some benefit?
Right.
So there's a whole slew of things that I think we can do.
Okay. We have about 2 minutes left, and I would like to see some questions from the audience. So this is your chance to ask your pressing security questions of this distinguished panel of experts. We have no question. There we have one, right there.
So there are several representatives of security companies. I was just wondering, especially in light of IoT, how many of you are working together with the, let's say, developers and developer frameworks to actually build more secure systems, especially for the IoT world, from the ground up? Implement, for instance, memory safety. You know, forget about unsafe memory languages. Build 2FA into frameworks so that developers actually start building software. And I'm wondering if there isn't any tension here in between security applied retroactively to software and not building it from the ground up.
Yeah.
Take it.
Good.
Yeah. We have actually tried to do that with a number of device manufacturers, and have basically received zero interest or zero desire for doing so. Once again, it's because what I brought up earlier, the cost issue. They're trying to strive for the cheapest functional product possible and taking the additional effort of building security in. They don't see that right now. It gives them a sales advantage.
Raj?
Maybe you've got a different...
Yeah, so actually IoT is like that wide. And so it's difficult for me to say we've done X for IoT because wearables, consumables, energy, the whole thing changes. But we're working with energy manufacturers, automation contractors within the energy space, both nuclear, substation, oil and gas, developing new meters. We're working with the automotive industry. We've got an automotive security review board. I mean, we have 101 different use cases that I can bore you with, which I've run out of time. So.
We are pretty much
Which
out
is
of
an
time.
enterprise versus I'm speaking on consumer.
Yeah.
That's okay. Did you want to handle that question at all?
Yeah, very much. I think certainly what we're doing, I can't talk, again, we haven't got time to talk about specifics, but we have our own range of technologies, but also working with all the range of different technologies available on the market, including, of course, Intel and others, focused on the integration, the self-learning, the understanding between the different tools and technologies to try to maximize the protection that organizations can get so that the tools don't stand on their own. And we have a virtuous feedback loop between the detection and the future prevention.
Mark?
Yeah,
Time for you to get in on this one, and we got to go.
I'm in the situation that my employer, Ergon, they also are in this business of programming and producing things, connected things, embedded devices, especially for building automation. And especially in this case, of course, we are working tightly together, the security and the others, and for these products, security is also a crucial value there. But for all the other devices, I cannot really say that we work them probably too small for that then.
Okay, great. We're out of time. So thanks for being here, and thanks everybody for being on the panel. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
there we are. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.